One, two, three.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. And can I remind those who are listening this evening that Scéalta is a joint production of Fáilte, Feirste here and Féile and Phobail. And my guest is also my friend, which always makes it easier. She is a senior lecturer, an Emeritus scholar. She is a community activist. She is a person who has been heavily involved in women's politics, community politics. She is a mother. She is a partner. She's all of those things. And I don't know how to describe you, but I want to describe you on this, and there's a reason for it. She's a poet. And I want to return to your poetry. So it's Eilish Rooney. So Eilish, welcome to Scéalta. I'm delighted that you're with us this evening. And I give you all those titles, and I know you're very modest about what titles actually mean. But there is a journey to reach that you have been on to get those titles. They weren't given to you. There was stuff that you earned. So, Ballymurphy girl?
Absolutely, yeah. Grew up in Ballymurphy. Wasn't born there now, Joe. You'll be happy to hear that I was born in Brown Square.
I know well.
We call Brown. Oh, did you know that?
I know very well.
Have you been ahead of the game then?
Well,
I thought I was telling you something you didn't know.
I'm in Carrickhill.
Right.
So it's round the corner.
Right, Carrickhill. So, but it was Ballymurphy from I was about the age of 4, and grew up there in Whitecliff Drive. Mm-hmm. Great wee street. It's called a drive, but there's no way you can drive it. It's a wee closed off street, you know, with steps at either side. I'm sure you know it on the White Rock Road.
Oh, I do. Good memories or hard memories?
Wonderful memories, Joe. Wonderful memories of growing up surrounded by playgrounds, really. There was the city cemetery on the White Rock Road where we played as kids. There was the Falls Park, the great coolers that you wouldn't remember.
No.
I'm older than you.
But I know of them,
And you had the Black Mountain. So my memory of growing up in Ballymurphy was of great times as kids, playing in the street the day long, and you know, being called for something to eat or being called to be given a piece with sugar on it, you know, that kind of thing. I remember vividly. And you know, gangs of kids in the winter playing nighttime games, you know, rally-o, gathering at a lamppost and people going and hiding and chasing after each other. To me, and it's not rose-tinted glasses I'm using here, as a child and us children, in our little child community, we had the best of times, yeah.
I know that Kathleen, your mother, was a tremendous influence in all of your lives, all of the lives of all the children. Mm-hmm. And she is described to me by someone who knew her through her work with Spring Hill House and Father Daisy Wilson, who is what I suppose as close as we was ever going to get to meeting a saint. But she's described as a woman who cared for her family, cared for her street, and cared for anything she thought needed cared for.
That's very
and
true.
Is that your memory of her as well?
That's very true. Well, my memory of her is my mummy, you know, and when I think of her as a person that other people would know, I think of a kind of different kind of person, you know, but she certainly was a user and a contributor to Spring Hill Community House when it was 1, 2, 3. And she found, she found a way to work there with the people there and work on the mission that they were on, which was to get people's voices heard. So I often remember her telling me about Jerry Fitt, for instance, coming to Spring Hill Community House and her being there and asking him some questions about what was he doing in Westminster and what questions had he asked. And he turned to Father Des and said, well, Father, I'll give you a copy of Hansard and maybe you'll let these people know. And I remember my mummy being quite angry at the idea that he was going to give Des. Yeah. And Des not being happy about it too. It's a small thing, Joe, but it's typical of my mummy that she would have picked up on that. And she was certainly somebody who spoke up and spoke her mind and expected to be treated with respect.
Was she a woman before her time?
I think in later years I thought that. As I was a young person growing up, she was a woman also like most of the women who wanted to fit in. For example, I remember mummy going out and wearing a scarf going out the door. She always wore a scarf going out the door. Yeah. And somehow or other that was expected. It was a kind of behaviour that was expected of women. I think as years went on, and certainly as the Troubles started, I think that changed everybody's life in relation to how they understood and responded to authority, especially the authority of the Catholic Church, that didn't step up and speak for them. And I think that the experience of that and the experience of her own children and the different lives we led meant that she became very forward-looking. Maybe some ways more forward-looking than we were at some stages in our lives, you know.
It strikes me, I am a great believer, and more of these interviews I do, the pattern you can see in some people's lives. And there used to be an old Belfast expression that you don't lick it from the stones, you don't just pick things up, that you nearly inherit these experiences and these causes. And reading through material about you last night, every second line, you know, defending women's interests, looking after women's education, pioneering women's rights and all of that. And your mother was doing that before it was fashionable, before it had a title.
That's very true.
That was the point that I was asking.
That was very true. And I remember having to think about that and work out, you know, at what stage as a young person I became aware of what equality meant and what equality meant in particular for women. And I remember reflecting on my experience as a child and thinking that equality then, if I had to choose between being my father going out and working in the shipyard and being my mother living at home with the children and in the street, I certainly would have felt that equality would have went towards the woman. I would have wanted to live the life that she lived. Do you know? So it was an interesting angle to come at the whole notion of equality, because he missed everything. I mean, he was out working. As far as I was concerned, he was missing the life that I valued and loved. Now, you get older and you realise that women served their husbands very much. They were secondary, to put it mildly, in their lives, and depended on men for the money and for the upkeep of the home and for so much else. You know, so the picture became complicated as you became older. But certainly, you know that phrase that James Connolly uses, that, you know, working class men, working class women are the slaves of slaves. You know, I came to know that as true.
I think that inequality serves none of us well.
Absolutely.
And men suffer from the inequality that they've inflicted, just as a gender prisoner nearly, on other people, and you don't see the best. Although one of the things that came across, I was asking people again last night, and I'm not going to divulge who they were, but I know you're going to ask me, and they were saying that a number of things that'll feature through the interview, but your father was exceedingly proud of us, and of all his children, and you know, and what it made the point of in that.
And he was a proud man, and a proud man who loved to talk about politics, about religion. He was just a man interested in the world and interested in Labour politics very much. And that's, if you like, where I first learned from him at the Fireside. He had a pencil and I asked him a question: what does left and right wing mean in politics, Daddy? And he drew a line and kind of explained and then elaborated on what that meant for us as the people that we were, and what it meant for him. He was a trade unionist in the shipyard. He survived in the shipyard.
And that itself is something.
Told stories about his life in the shipyard. And you know, about the 12th celebration, when it came July in the shipyard, good friends of his, fellow trade unionists, would come to him and say, Dan, right, words didn't have to be spoken.
Will not be talking to you for a month.
Will not be talking to you for a month. You know, that was the case.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I introduced you maybe wrongly, and I'll apologise when we're talking later, because you're worth more than the sum total of your academia credentials, you know, and I want to just explain what I mean by that. I asked someone about you in St. Rose's, and they said she had a hunger for education and for learning. Were you conscious of that? Were you an inquisitive young girl? Were you?
I had a teacher in St. Kevin's who used to read Anne of Green Gables on a Friday afternoon. Thank you, Miss McSherry. She's long gone. I looked forward to Friday afternoon. We all did. Everybody in the class did. Because we just went into a world with Anne of Green Gables of
yeah,
all
yeah.
people.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
But you know, week on week on week. So I would say from a very young age, Joe, I loved literature. I loved words, and I loved where they could take you. And this is me kind of making the child that I was more aware of herself than I was at the time. I'm remembering then how much I loved that. And then when I went to St. Rose's as a 14-year-old actually, came across great teachers, absolutely wonderful teachers, and great non-teachers as well, inspirational people. And you know, that stayed with me. So I'm not sure if it was me who was inquisitive and interested in the world. I think we all were as kids, but I came across some teachers who I gravitated towards and who I saw as, you know, keepers of the flame, if you like, you know, people who you could learn from.
We asked someone, Scéalta that has asked someone, I can't recall and what the context of it was, but I asked them about teaching. I think it was Fergus O'Hare. I think it was Fergus. As Fergus had been a teacher, as you know, and he this is a throwaway comment that only Fergus gets away with, and he said, you know, good teachers are born, they're not trained. Right. And I think what you say there, you know, that inspiration, that ability to see what is there within a young person is so important, and does shape their lives.
It does.
You left St. Rose's. Mm-hmm. Where did you?
I have my sister Maureen to thank for getting me a job in a factory that made men's trousers.
Very good.
Now,
Maureen's a quiet one.
There's nobody in our family quiet.
There's
nobody in our family quiet. But I'm saying she's the person to thank, because I didn't want to work in a factory making men. Clarence's clothing factory in it's a street off Donegal Road. That'll come to me. Clarence's clothing factory. Oh my goodness. I don't think I forgave her for years for getting me that job. Anyway, I went and did this job in the factory. That was an education of another kind. That was hard work. And everybody worked round the clock to get up to make their money. Mm-hmm. Do you know, that was piece money. Sure. And around about 6 months in or so, maybe less, I started to feel that maybe I would like to be a Dominican.
A nun?
A nun.
Oh.
A lay sister, right? Yeah. And I started to talk to the nun, one of the nuns who taught me in St. Dominic, in St. Rose's. They were in St. Dominic's at the time, and talked to her about the feeling that I had a vocation. Now, I look back on it and I think to myself, what would you do to get out of a factory? Yeah. And I'm not saying...
That's a bit extreme, yeah.
I'm not saying... But I did, and I talked to my mummy and daddy about feeling that I had this vocation and that I wanted to return to education and fulfil that vocation. Yeah. And the school took me back.
As a mature student?
As a mature student.
Yeah.
Mature student meaning that I was, 15. But they put me back in a lower class where I could go through some of the junior cert exams. So that's what I did for the next year then, Joe. So I left St. Rose's twice.
It is a wee bit like Anne of Green Gables itself, isn't it?
well, you said that, I didn't.
No, it is a wee bit like it. So
it was a big thing, by the way, for them to allow me to leave a wage behind.
Your parents?
My parents.
Oh, of course it was, absolutely.
And to go back into school. It was a tremendous vote of faith and confidence too,
Coming out of that very protective, very nearly idyllic childhood, and St. Rose's is a big school, but it's not a giant school, and then get into a factory. Was that life, that big life, that big girl's life, that big person's life, was it a shock to you? Was it frightening? Did you learn from it?
Oh no, it was so, I have to say too, you see, maybe it was so exciting, Joe, in its way as well. It was hard work.
Yeah.
My aunt worked in the factory and my sister worked in the factory. And whenever there would have been a bit of activity in the Plaza Ballroom, a crowd of these women would go down at lunchtime. All of them would have their rollers in. They'd go down to the Plaza Ballroom, remove the rollers.
In the city centre.
In the city centre, get made up and go out dancing over their lunchtime. Must have been for about half an hour or so. and then back to the factory.
And back to the sweatshop.
That's one of the memories that I have of that time, you know. But I also have, I mean, it was tough. It was hard work, but everybody kind of just was in it together, you know. But I'm thinking, Joe, we're moving on to St. Rose's, and we've left the primary school behind. There's something that I learned when I, you know, almost left Ballymurphy when I first went into school. Let
me just correct you, and I don't do this very often. You've never left Ballymurphy. Ballymurphy is ingrained in you.
Well, I'm proud you're saying that.
We're going to come to these poems, and it'll speak for itself, but you've never left Ballymurphy.
Well, and this is about Ballymurphy, really. What I learned when I went into school as a primary school kid was that the people from Ballymurphy were treated a wee bit differently from everybody else in the class. And that was shocking learning, actually, when I look back on it. But it was very vivid and real. For instance, you know, there were no buses. The kids walked down from Ballymurphy. And if you were late in the school, the head teacher came around and slapped everybody who was late. And more often than not, it would have been Ballymurphy kids. Yeah. But more than that, Joe, there was a difference made towards kids from Ballymurphy. They were somehow regarded as lesser than. And it was around those years and subsequently that Ballymurphy became known as like a sink estate.
Yeah.
Trouble.
Yeah.
That was Ballymurphy. It was trouble. And in fact, to my shame, whenever I left St. Rose's the second time and became interested in going out with boys and met a fella, I was serving in a shop and I met a fella and I went out with him and he asked me where I lived and I said the White Rock.
Well, you know. Well, I have to say, in your defence, if you're not going to defend it, I mean, you've spent a lifetime praising the people of Ballymurphy, defending the people of Ballymurphy, and the people in general. And I'm going to come to that because I want to talk to you about. Sean for just briefly, but I want to talk to you about later on through this conversation, the Ballymurphy massacre and the impact that it had not only on the families but on the community. But let me keep jumping you forward.
Okay.
You're a mature student. You're back studying. At that stage did you have a sense of direction what you were studying for? Were you going to become a teacher? What was your view?
Well, at the time I was in St. Rose's I was intending to enter the convent.
Oh, still at that stage?
At that stage.
Right.
That's why I went back and I was intending to enter the convent. But after a year I did my junior certificate and at the end of that year I left the St. Rose's and got a job.
Okay.
Got a clean job, a job where you didn't have to wash your hands before you left work at night.
Which was a step up, I suppose, from the hard work that you'd been doing, not that it wasn't difficult. Was there a stage where you decided, you know, I'm going to be in academia, I'm going to graduate, I'm going to do all of that. Was that a gradual?
It was a gradual thing, Joe, and it wasn't a thing that I saw myself doing. Whenever I had 2 children,
Mo and Sean
Oak. Yeah. I thought I'd like to go back and do A level. And as much as anything, it was a night out of the house, a night where you weren't.
You're very honest. Yeah.
You weren't. Yeah. You know, the mummy and the house cleaner and the you know that. And it took me. It took me. You know, it took me to my Friday afternoons in school. You were out. I was out to study literature. And there was a place called the College of Business Studies. Don't know if you remember it.
Oh, I do, yeah.
Joe, and they did A levels, and I decided, hey, go for A level. And I went to night class, and I tell you, it was one of those. It was an escape that brought you home in a way too. You know, I mean, literature is like that. It takes you out, but it brings you home to your heart, to what matters in the world and in life. So I did A-level literature, not with with the intention of doing A-level literature.
And stopping?
Not knowing what else I would do. And the teacher who taught me A-level literature encouraged me to go on and do A-level history. And when I did A-level history, with the other friends that I'd met at the college, the next step was to apply for university, which is what I did.
Well, let me stop you there, because I want to ask you about that boy who came into the shop. Was that Sean?
No, it wasn't.
Where does Sean come into our picture?
Well, Sean comes into the picture very early on. Whenever I was about 15 or so, and had gone back to St Rose's, I got myself a bike, and I broke down on the bike on the White Rock Road one time, and Sean was standing at his friend's, one of the Crummies, gate, and offered to fix it for me. Now, Sean was from the red brick houses in the White Rock, Joe.
Oh, those.
So he was like a step up.
He was a snob.
He was a step up.
Yeah.
Plus he was a tradesman. He was a joiner, and he was the handsomest man I've ever seen.
He says that often about himself, I have to tell you.
I think my heart leapt when I saw him. First time, seriously.
Absolutely.
I just thought he was gorgeous. Now, I think he had another girlfriend on the go but at the time, but I waited her out.
Good for you. Good for you. So you've got kind of a boy in mind. Your education's going somewhere, not quite sure where it's going to go.
Yeah.
Did you go back to Queen's at this? I mean, I know I'm jumping back and forward, but was Queen's the next big adventure for you?
It was indeed.
And I've never been to, well, I've been through universities and stood outside looking in, but I've never been in. Aren't they sensible? So tell me, and I know that a lot of the stuff you do, you speak about the need to be assertive, the need to be defending who you are and who you've come from. But was it daunting, this Ballymurphy woman in the middle of Queen's, or did you not care?
Completely, no. It was completely daunting, and as much as I didn't know how to get there. I didn't know where Queen's was. I brought our Maureen by the hand, a 5-year-old child, and had to go down to the City Hall and say to somebody, how do you get to Queen's? You know, what bus do you get?
Amazing.
I didn't know how to, you know, and then went and went through the process that you went through. I met other mature students there, people who'd come on a similar journey, and that was a gift because we in it together. And some of the younger students used to gravitate to our corner in the coffee bar. So it was like two worlds almost, Joe, you know, living in the world. By that time Sean and I were living in Dermot Hill with our 2 children. And I was going to Queen's, to classes at Queen's, and trying to sort out the children for different periods of the day. But the brilliant thing about Queen's and having kids was, you know, you went for lectures and then you were free to come home. And you weren't going every single day. But the other thing to remember, and this is critical for all of us, is that the Education Act of 1948, if you like, the social contract that came out of the Second World War, enabled me and hundreds and thousands like me to return to education, get my fees paid, and get a grant. That's unimaginable today.
Of course it is, yeah.
You know, and that was the case for all the mature students there at the time.
Just for someone who isn't familiar with the geographics of where we're talking about, maybe not even the period where we're talking about. So we're talking about before it was fashionable. You're a mature student, you're at Queen's, you've 2 children, and you've got our Sean. You're living in West Belfast at a time of chaos, absolute chaos.
That's right.
You're living in an area where the Ballymurphy massacre had taken place,
Yeah.
affected the whole community.
Yeah.
You're someone who's doing the things that really don't be done, a mature student and a woman and all of that.
Yeah.
Your mother, who we spoke of, Kathleen, you explained that she had an encounter, or she had a participation in Spring Hill House, Desi Wilson's house for that.
That's right.
And so had you.
That's right.
Tell me about that.
Oh, that's right. Well, I used to go to Desi's place for different occasions and different events. You know, they would have unionist politicians, loyalist spokespeople. All of that never got written into the record. Never got written into the record. It was never acknowledged publicly. But so I was a part of all of that, part of going with my mummy at times, you know. And then you had the holy shows, you had the whole activity of Spring Hill Community House.
Plays, the drama.
All of it, yeah. So I was participating in that, and a friend of the house, if you like, and a participant in the house, you know, all the way through from early days. Sean indeed went with Des and Noel up to the house in Falcara.
In Donegal, yeah.
In Donegal, and put in windows, made doors. You know, he did the joiner up there. And so we had a deep involvement with Des and Noel in the house, before I was asked by Noel, I think it was about in the late 70s, would I like to come and teach in the house? And I went.
So explain, because this is something that I think people, there's a much abused word that's become fashionable, and it's describing those who have passed as being great. And many of them are great. Many of them who deserve to be called great are not, and Daisy Wilson and Noel are too, just to give you an example. Mm-hmm. So this is a house in a working class area that a priest who has been jilted by the Catholic Church and a nun who has defended him, Noel, set up a creative education hub.
That's right.
And into it they bring all these characters and politicians and all of that, and then you begin. Who do you teach? Who are the people that are there to be taught?
Well, that was the people who turned up. It was an education centre, radical to its core. But the radical element of it came from the fact that it was an open door. No one had to pay for their education. Education was free. The people in the house made their way to making up for fees that had to be paid to the education authority, to the college. But people just stepped in the door, and for that reason they had an ownership of what was going on in the room where the teaching happened that I've never experienced in any other place, and I've taught in many places.
Oh, yeah.
Teaching in Spring Hill, you were by the fireside. Halfway through the class, Noel would bring in a tray of tea and biscuits for everybody, and the crack was mighty. And I mean the crack about Shakespeare, about Chaucer, about all the greats that were on the curriculum. In other words, Joe, what I'm trying to get at is we had a standard curriculum, A-level curriculum, that was taught in Spring Hill. And then a crowd of us would go to Fáilte for a weekend before the exams, and we would study intensively. Not intensively enough, in my opinion. Everybody was out to the pub in the evening. Well, but nevertheless, why not? Why not? But what I suppose I want to convey is that the very setting of the education, the very setting of the house just up the street, the people who came were local people.
Mm-hmm. Amazing.
Who wanted to do A-level.
I'm going to ask you to read a poem, because I described you as a poet, and you're a poet. But before I do, I want you to catch your breath. And I want just to say that we talk about community and communities, and Spring Hill House, Daisy Wilson's house, the house you taught in, was the blueprint, and it was the epitome of a community being a community looking after itself.
That's true.
Writing. I think anybody that writes anything is very brave. So when did you start poetry, and how did you get to that stage?
I've been writing poetry for longer than I can remember, Joe, but on and off, different words would come to me, and you know, I'd scribble, if you like. They're maybe like scribbles. I have a folder now in my computer which is called poetry. You know, it's my poems, and I'd never sought to publish them, and most of them wouldn't be publishable at all. No, they wouldn't. But I've always written. I've always kept something like a journal or a diary. I mean, going way back. You know, whenever I was probably still at St. Rose's, and I was doing little jottings in a diary. You know, but I agree with you that it's brave to write, Joe. Mm. But you see, as you're talking to me every so often, I'm hearing Des over my shoulder, Father Des over my shoulder, and he's saying, I'm not sure. He would always encourage you, Joe.
Of course he would.
He would say, write it down.
Yeah.
He knew the power of the written word. But the written word, of course, then has to be published.
Well, let me just come to that, because you're going to get ready for your poem. And this is the book of Ballymurphy poems. It's a book that you have written, and you've dedicated it to the families of the Ballymurphy massacre. You've also, the funds of it, any money that's raised from it goes to them. Can I just say, and I'm putting you up perhaps, it's a love story.
Thank you.
I've read it several times since I've got it, and you're not getting out without telling me some of the secrets. But the reason that I felt strongly to say that you never left Ballymurphy, because there it is. Mm-hmm. That's the love letters to Ballymurphy. They're all in there. That's what it is. So
thank you, Joe.
Over to you.
I did dedicate it to the Ballymurphy families and the Kieran Cahill.
Yeah, and the Kieran Cahill. Of course, absolutely.
And, it's a free book, but Springhill Community House and the Ballymurphy families agree that a donation to the Ballymurphy families Memorial Garden would be welcome.
The cost of the book was incurred by you, so it wasn't free to you, it was free.
No, it's free to everybody else.
So, tell me about the poem
this
we're going to read.
This poem I'm going to read is called Internment. It's the first poem in the book. And it came to me to write a poem that I'm going to read because I was intrigued about Operation Demetrius. Why was internment called Operation Demetrius? And in the course of wondering about that, we were at the inquest in Laganside, at the inquest that was held in the courts there. And so I started to investigate why Operation Demetrius was Operation Demetrius. And this poem came out of thinking about language and words and Ballymurphy too. Internment. Some long forgotten military planner called it Operation Demetrius, in honour of the warrior king of Macedonia. It was said he conquered but never ruled. That was written by James V. Burke. Demetrius lives on in Ireland, and it was published in the New York Times on the 13th of March 1983. In Laganside Courthouse, courtroom 12, military witnesses often refer to Operation Demetrius. Families facing them look and listen. They have waited a long time to see and hear the men in charge tell what happened that day and why. Who ordered the shooting? In their evidence, the long forgotten military planner is called to mind and forgotten in one and the same breath. Much as the river is remembered at the courthouse, far from its ancient origins, Owen and Lagan, far as Ballymurphy is from Macedonia, where Demetrius made a name for himself.
Excellent, excellent. Very poignant and very focused. So excellent. I'm going to ask you to read another one, as you probably are not surprised. So we've talked a wee bit about everything, I suppose. The anchors in your life, of course, are Sean Oak, and can I call her Mo?
Yeah.
Okay, and Mo. So Sean was a joiner who followed you or led you, I'm not sure which, but he also went in to teaching people skills. Mm-hmm. So tell me a wee bit about Sean.
When we were in Dermot Hill, we had next door neighbours who were great friends, and maybe they might have been about 5 years older than us, maybe not much more, but they seemed a lot older to us. And Brian and Ethel Hamill they were, and Brian Hamill was carrying on his education. He and I used to go to the town for a class on the same evening. Brian tried to encourage Sean to get off the tools. That's what it was called.
Yeah.
Because being on the tools in the winter was a very hard job. Yeah. So Sean went with him and went along with his encouragement and went back to education himself.
And became a teacher.
A woodwork teacher.
And Gorton Mona for a while, and then Conway Mill, if I have it right.
That's right.
And that's another example of people like yourselves populating, teaching where teaching is required as opposed to where it's paid. Absolutely. It makes a big difference.
Absolutely. He was a women's woodwork teacher. It was a women's class that did woodwork in the mill back then.
It's a wee bit ironic into what the mills, the slave houses of the linen trade, and there you have a source of women's liberation taking place in the mill. So that's good. That's a full circle. Sean and Mo, I'm not sure who's the oldest.
Mo's the oldest.
Okay. So her mother and father are out in a world of academia, either studying or teaching or doing all that there. And as your mother, you had followed, did they just fit into all of this, or did they understand what was going on? Or
do you know, it's very interesting when you think of your children and their experiences, Joe, because you've got your perspective. You know, you've got your experience of them, and they've got theirs. And I think they enjoyed, if you like, the world that opened up for them as a result of Sean's and my work and studying and decisions that we took. They benefited, certainly, in some ways. But I wonder too, well, you know, it mightn't have been easy for them either as well, you know, because I undertook my studies very seriously and gave a lot of time to it, you know, so I think they were happy enough, but it's hard to say. You'd have to ask them.
And I will, and I think that their levelness in their own lives is a testimony that there was a good training. I think it's Mo a nurse.
She is palliative care.
Palliative care.
Yeah.
And Sean, I don't know Sean, does he take after you? Does he take after his father? Is it a bit of both?
It's a bit of both, I think, but he's his own person too.
That's great. That's obviously.
Yeah.
I said to you earlier on that what keeps coming through in all of the work that you do is the need to defend women and women's interests. And you're on a number of committees and subcommittees and papers that have been written. Is there any particular one that stands out for you that gives you kind of the most satisfaction?
Or the most trend?
You know, type of work and type of campaign that you're involved in.
When I was in my academic work more fully, what I was very keen to do was to articulate the position of women in our society, mainly during the conflict and during the transition from conflict. And what I was very keen to do was to try and, if you like, theorise women's positions in relation to, if you like, intersectionality. Intersectionality as a theory was developed in the States in, you know, African American studies in law. And what it recognised was that you're not only a woman or only a man, but that you have lots of other positionings in society that strongly determine and shape what your life's going to be like. So here, being from a Catholic background, working class, and having a nationalist outlook, or being a loyalist, working class, with a working class outlook and a loyalist outlook, that these dimensions come together in a life and help to explain some of the conflict and some of the consequences for people. Now, I'm hesitating to go there, Joe, because whenever people hear the word theory, they kind of go, yeah, but it really is important.
I like to hear it. I like to hear it, so feel free.
Well, no, in a way that poetry is important. Whenever I write a poem, the words chosen are chosen carefully. They may sound as though they just come together almost naturally. But the reason I think poetry is so important is because poetry makes us rethink, reimagine, and maybe understand differently what we thought we understood before.
Yeah.
Right? So I think theory similarly tries to open up an understanding. And for me, an understanding of women's lives here, I thought, was very, very important to understand really the fullness of what women's experience is of the conflict. For me, if you like, feminism very often focused on gender as meaning a woman's identity, but seemed either reluctant or unable, or maybe the time wasn't right here, to recognise that women are also identified as people who have affiliation to the state and people for whom the state is in some ways a stranger, in as much as you don't belong.
Yeah, you have no allegiance to it.
Yeah.
I'm interested in asking you, and I want to pursue this maybe just a wee bit. I don't want to take you, I don't want to distract you, but I know you worked in the Bridge of Hope in the north of the city where I'm from. And in many ways, geographically and location-wise, it's round the corner from the west, but it's, I think, a million miles away in many of its values. Was there a different type of experience working over there, say, for instance, from working in Spring Hill House? Or were problems always the same, but were different names?
No, that was a fascinating area of work. Aaron Sherry, who ran Bridge of Hope for the Ashton Centre, and I worked together. So we kind of, what she did was she brought the community along and I brought the academics along, and we worked on a programme called the Transitional Justice Grassroots Toolkit. It was fascinating work, Joe. People in North Belfast at that time, both in Loyalist districts and in Republic districts, were keen to hear more about what transitional justice was. They were living transitional justice. They were often the people that academics came to and interviewed for hours on end to find out how transition was working or not working. And yet they were never the authors of the accounts that would be given about what transitional justice was. So transitional justice is other ways of resolving the justice issues after a conflict. What we did was design a little toolkit where people could record for themselves what the experience was like. And we met with open doors wherever we went, whatever district we went to. In North Belfast, people in Loyalist communities welcomed us, participated, went on weekends to do the toolkit. And it was, I must say, looking back on it now, it was an absolutely amazing experience.
I think the sense of it speaks for itself. But before we had begun the interview, we both commented on a tour bus that went down past the window, and it was almost like people going on a safari, looking down on us, looking down on the inmates. And I think those authors that you refer to who come into working class areas, irrespective of where they are, and ask for stories, or asked for interviews, and go off and write it with little consideration for them. They're a bit like vampires, you know. They take the blood away and they don't give anything back. Let me ask you this, and I know your thirst for rights is universal. It isn't about, and I know I've made comment about Ballymurphy, but it isn't only. When you look at some of the happenings in working class areas in general, Loyalist working class areas in particular, does it give you a sense of hope or fear or apprehension? Do you think that from those days of you walking down the White Rock Road in the rain to go to school, to go back to school, to go wherever you're going, have we progressed enough? Are we not there? Are we getting there?
Oh, we're getting there, Joe. I think surely we're getting there. I think that there's a lot at stake politically at the moment. I mean, the future is at stake politically. The constitutional futures that we face on the island are at stake at the moment. So that puts political unionism in a position of defensiveness and in many cases of making a position and making a claim that the position will not be yielded. So it can sound and seems, and for many people perhaps it is, totally intransigent. In my experience of people's lives on the ground, like the people in Ballymurphy, the people in other districts who are wrestling with life day to day, there's a lot at stake in another dimension of your life. And it relates directly to constitutional futures. But it relates to constitutional futures in the sense of how can life be better?
And that's what it's all about.
I think that's what it has to be about. How can life be better for all of us?
Has to be.
And that recognition that life can be better and that we can make life better together, I think, is the way forward.
I'm going to ask you to close the show with your second poem. I want to make the point again that these poems are dedicated to the families of the Ballymurphy massacre. That the book isn't on sale per se, but donations are graciously accepted. The bigger the donation, the more gracious me and you can be. But I want you just to tell me just a bit about the background of the poem, and then if you don't mind reading us the poem.
This poem is called Waste Ground, and it's the second poem in the collection. I'm reading it because each of the poems in the first section of the book are about the inquest and the incidents where people were killed. And if I couldn't pick out a single poem, you know, I found it difficult to pick out a single poem for you, Joe.
Yeah.
So I'm just reading the next poem. As I say, it's called Waste Ground. But it was triggered by listening to a military witness at the inquest saying that he was one of the spare men sent to the flats overlooking the waste ground where Father Hugh Mullen and Frank Quinn were killed.
Yeah.
But it was just spare men, he said. And that triggered this poem in me. So it's Waste Ground. 1. Spare men. A witness at the inquest today spoke about spare men in the attachment sent to Springmartin. They weren't all members of 2 Para Support Company anti-tank platoon who were there that day. But, the witness said, they were all parachute regiment trained. He was one of them. 2. Brick. 5 months later in Derry, an attachment of 1 Para Support Company entered Glenfadda Park. Not spare men, but a brick covering for each other. One was a crack shot with Ballymurphy experience, Saville was told in London. 4 men lay dead. 3. High ground. The attachment gets to the high ground the smart way from the mountain ahead of Queen's Regiment. 2 remain with the vehicle. The others head to the flats overlooking the waste ground and the action. They take some rounds and use some. Frank Quinn, Father Hugh Mullen, lost lives. 4. The stand. The man on the stand today gave the order, watch and shoot, to men whose names he no longer recalls. One may have been a crack shot. Another was later blown up by an IRA landmine. The witness fired 7 rounds. Another soldier, he says, fired 1. At gunmen only. Yes, they'd talk at regimental reunions about the Falklands. Never Ballymurphy.
It's very moving, that poem, I have to say, and it's a fitting way to close this interview. So for being my guest and for sharing those memories, can I thank you? This is why Scéalta is important. So Eilish Rooney, Gara Míle Maith, thank you.
Gara Míle Maith, Joe.